task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
In Environment and Infrastructure, Chapter 7. Introduction. Legacy of slavery, legal segregation, and government policies known as redlining have created environmental impacts that have harmed and continue to harm African Americans. First, government policies forced African Americans to live in poor quality housing, exposing them to disproportionate amounts of lead poisoning, and increasing their risks of disease, including COVID-19. Outside of their homes, African Americans are also exposed to far more pollutants than white Americans, partially because redlining explicitly grouped African Americans and other, inharmonious racial groups with polluting sources. Second, government actors developed infrastructure projects, like highways and parks, in ways that destroyed and segregated Black communities, and also failed to provide or repair public services like sewage lines and water pipes. And finally, African Americans and their homes are more vulnerable than white Americans to the dangerous effects of extreme weather patterns like heat waves, disparities which are made worse by climate change. 6. Section 3 of this chapter addresses the substandard housing and overcrowding problems faced by African Americans throughout American history caused by government practices including redlining. IV of this chapter discusses the environmental pollutants to which African Americans are exposed as a result of similar and related government practices, which disproportionately continues to subject African Americans to hazardous waste management, oil and gas production, automobile and diesel fumes. Section B addresses the discriminatory choices made by government actors in implementing infrastructure development and related public services, which consistently have disadvantaged African Americans. Section B addresses the discriminatory impacts of climate change, which are experienced disproportionately by African Americans as a result of government actions and policies that have imposed those harms on them. 49. Chapter 7. Racism in Environment and Infrastructure. 2. Substandard housing and overcrowding. In American history and to this day, African Americans have lived in housing of worse quality than white Americans and paid more to live in it. 7. Nationally. In the early 20th century, as African Americans primarily rented housing in urban areas, they were consistently charged higher rents than white people. Or the Federal Fair Housing Act made housing discrimination based on race illegal. Landlords would freely admit that they needed to charge Black renters higher rent because white renters did not want to share an apartment building with African Americans. For the higher rents, Black families often took in lodgers or shared apartments, which created additional overcrowding. 10. As of 2010, about 2.6 million, 7.5% non-Hispanic Black people and 5.9 million white people, 2.8%, live in substandard housing in America, which is defined largely in relation to the housing's susceptibility to waterborne and airborne communicable diseases. Black households are almost twice as likely as white households to lack indoor plumbing nationwide. Black households are more poorly ventilated than white households in general, leading to excess moisture that supports the growth of mold and vermin, which can lead to or exacerbate asthma and other breathing issues. 13. Families also still experience overcrowded housing, generally defined as either having more than 1.5 or more than 2 persons per room living in a household, at 3 times the rates of white Americans. Teen overcrowded housing is linked with physical and mental health problems, including higher rates of exposure to household lead poisoning. This association may be correlative rather than causative, since overcrowded housing is more likely to be older housing, more likely to house low-income workers in heavy industries that may cause them to bring lead dust and other contaminants into the household. 16. Overcrowding has similarly shown to increase the risk of infectious diseases, such as tuberculosis, diarrhea, and infectious respiratory illnesses. 17. At least one recent study demonstrated that overcrowding and other poor housing conditions correlated with greater rates of COVID-19 infections across the country, as well as increased mortality from COVID-19. Housing also is linked with various mental health issues, including psychological distress, alcohol abuse, depression, and sleep disorders. Teen living in overcrowded housing is also associated with social withdrawal and feelings of helplessness. 20 as well as an increase in hostility among household residents due to the lack of privacy and time to oneself. Overcrowded housing also harms school performance for children, which has lasting impact on their educational attainment. Living in a house with too many people makes it difficult to find a quiet place to study. 23 and even a quiet place to sleep. 24 children in crowded houses are more likely to catch infectious diseases from others in their household, making it more likely for the child to stay home from school. 25 children from overcrowded homes are more likely to be held back a grade. 26 they show reduced math and reading test scores. 27 and they demonstrate higher rates of disruptive behaviors according to teachers. Moreover, some international research has found that children and adolescents in overcrowded housing are more likely to engage in violent behavior in the home. 29 as well as to be victims of sexual abuse. 30. California. California displays the same racial disparities regarding overcrowded housing as the rest of America. Recent data provided by the California Department of Public Health reveals that Black Californians are approximately 2 times more likely to live in housing considered overcrowded, and 2.8 times more likely to live in housing considered severely overcrowded compared to white Californians. 31. Californians have also been forced to live in substandard housing, sometimes as a direct result of government action. A historical example is the federal government's building of public housing in Richmond to accommodate ship workers during World War II, which was officially and explicitly segregated. 32 As part of those efforts, the federal government put programs in place that enabled white workers to access permanent, residential housing, but offered black workers no permanent housing. 33 While some black workers were able to find low-quality, long-term housing in areas of Bay, others lived in barns, minimal shelter like tents or cardboard shacks, or even without any shelter in open fields. 34. California specifically, the problem of overcrowded housing has been linked to the rapid spread of COVID-19 in neighborhoods with a higher number of black residents, such as South Los Angeles. 5 neighborhoods with overcrowded housing in California had rates of COVID-19 that were 3.7 times higher than neighborhoods without overcrowded housing. 36.